Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Sturt, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and young Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 2, we'll be chatting with young Canadians about their unconventional career trajectories and what it's like to be young entrepreneurial leaders. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. Kelsey Burdett is the guest on this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Kelsey is currently the Senior Manager of Partnerships for #Paid, where she's responsible for validating and building the partner program for the creator marketing platform. She's always had an interest in entrepreneurship and gets to flex those muscles by owning the market development business inside of the broader company. This interest in entrepreneurship predates her time at #Paid. She has spent her career supporting entrepreneurs through commerce technology at Shopify and with funding through Clearbank. She finds it incredibly interesting to work with some of the exact same merchants in such different capacities. Her contacts in sales and partnerships across these companies is also what led her to start her own podcast called They Get It, where she interviews entrepreneurs about their journeys building and scaling their companies. Kelsey, how are you doing today?
I'm so good, Scott. I'm excited to be here.
We're really excited to have you. And just for context as well, Kelsey Burdett is a 2016 Venture for Canada Fellow. Hard to believe that training camp for Venture for Canada for your cohort was 5 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Makes me feel so old.
Likewise, I said it does not seem like it's been 5 years at all.
I know.
One of the things I remember when you applied to Venture for Canada is you had quite unique experiences. In particular, the fact that you were a reporter during university, focusing on campus sports. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a reporter, and how did it influence your career trajectory?
Totally. It's so funny that you say that. I actually had my business career advisor when I was taking my VFC application to her and saying like, hey, I need some help. I really want to get into this program. She was like, you're the reporter, right? And I don't know why this sticks for everybody, but yeah, it was so much fun. I remember being in high school, watching the news with my dad being like, I want her job, and seeing the reporter on the news. And I started volunteering with Rogers Community Reporting, which was not glamorous by any means. I was setting up my own cameras. I was, testing my own mics. It was not the glamorous reporting that we think when we see, CTV and things like that. But then specifically with sports reporting, that's where like the rubber started to meet the road. It was really fun for me. It didn't feel like I was working, and I just got to go hang out with the teams, get to know everybody and report on it. But I think that was also a little bit disheartening when I saw like where you take it after university, right? It's easy to be like the in-game host and the reporter at Carleton when, you've got a great basketball game or great basketball team, I should say, but like what happens next? And if you look at women in broadcasting, specifically in sports, there's a shelf life. If you weren't an Olympic athlete, you're done by the time you're like 35 years old. And that was kind of disheartening to me. And so I think like reporting has natural kind of transferable skills, like being okay in front of a camera, being able to talk to people and that type of thing. But I think more than anything, it kind of helped push me into tech where there wasn't a shelf life and where I could see that longevity.
Yeah, I've never thought about that before in terms of the shelf life of reporters, and in particular within the sports space. And it's a challenging career to stay in long term. And I think just in general, kind of being a journalist, I recently listened to an interview with one reporter, and he works for ABC News, and that's what he said. It's kind of once in his sector, even once you reach the age of 50, you're kind of unless you're the main anchor, you're kind of pushed to the side. So he basically ended up founding a meditation app and kind of transitioning into a completely different space. So on the topic of transferable skills and how they're developed, what do you think are some of the transferable skills that you in particular learned from your extracurricular experiences, and how did those help you enter in your first role at Shopify?
Oh man, If you had asked me in that first month if I thought anything transferred into that role, I would have said definitely not. It just felt like I was like a fish out of water launching into tech at the first, at the beginning at least. Um, but yeah, I think just like being able to talk to people like a human, I think that's, a luxury that we have in tech is, especially with these entrepreneurs and these founders of these companies, they don't want all the tech jargon. They don't need to know the nitty gritty of how APIs are built. They just want someone to be able to explain it in a language that makes sense to them. And I think truly like the reporting and being able to translate what was happening on the court into something that people would listen to on air was a huge advantage. But I would be lying if I said I didn't feel like getting hit like a Mack truck. It was a lot to learn, from a tech standpoint, from even just like a sales process standpoint. So I think if I could pinpoint one transferable skill, it would be the like face-to-face interaction.
What on the topic of sales process? What are some of the sales process learnings you gained in your first role at Shopify?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So for anyone who's considering getting into sales, start with Sandler training. Go through that process and see if it's something that you even want to do, because I've seen so many people get into sales thinking it's one thing, learning the process and realizing it's not for them. Like save yourself the trouble, go do that first. Yeah. The other thing I learned is how everyone would tell me, like, I think growing up, because I didn't have a ton of exposure into sales, across verticals, that it was an art, right? You hear this art to selling. There's some people who just have it. That's so not true. Once you get into it, you realize that it is absolutely a science. And I would take someone who's more process oriented and watch them flourish over someone who's got it and see them, the being disorganized or not being able to understand next steps and things like that. So important. And so for me, it was all about building a cadence. So I would have a lead that would come in. I would have literally an email cadence where I've got a set of 8 to 12 emails, all with different value adds that I'm enrolling this person in. I would test, like I said, different value adds, different pain points, different mediums. So whether it's email, phone call, LinkedIn, social, whatever it might be. And really all you're doing is trying to capture that attention. It's not as simple as like being in front of you, Scott, and having a conversation. Once we're at this point, we're already really far down that path. It's how do I capture that attention first and get them to agree to a phone call with me? So I'd say that was probably the biggest learning and where I'd start for anyone looking to get into sales.
What's your principal tip for people in terms of how to write a really compelling cold email?
Pain, value, call to action. Super simple. 3 sentences, as few words as possible, and a captivating subject line. So the more creative you can be to actually get them to open your email, great. And once they're there, you better not waste their time.
What's your favorite subject line that you've ever written in an email?
I don't know. I've gotten pretty creative with some, because that was another one of my strengths is I would get these prospects on the line and we would establish this relationship. Well, even though you have a great connection with someone, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to close. And trust me, I've had my fair share of ghosted accounts. So I would experiment with like, is this a breakup? Did I lose you? Like trying to get people to open my email, and then I would just send a blank email. So it's literally just the subject line. And I had a pretty good recovery rate with that.
That is fantastic advice, and it's a great way to because I think anyone who's been in a sales or kind of external facing type role, we're all ghosted
Oh my
at different
gosh.
points, and
100%.
and it can be tough to get people's attention, like after to once they drop off. A lot of times I find they can be gone for forever, and I think it's a funny way we all get these. Sometimes when I'm being sold to, for instance, and I might be ghosting somebody, I'll get then just 3 of the exact same emails being like, hey, just following up. Hey, just following up. Your approach, I think, is a lot more creative than.
I got one, Scott. I have to tell this story. I got one now that I'm in the partnerships role. I get a lot of sales emails. And I got a couple recently where they're like mad at me for not opening their emails, and they're getting like resentful and starting to get snippy. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. If you want me to jump on a call with you, this is not the method. But it's funny, in my sales experience, I have a little bit of empathy because I remember being in their shoes, being like, why isn't this person answering? I've sent them so many emails, but it's just not that simple.
Agreed. And I can think back in the early days of Venture for Canada and a few people who completely ghosted me after meeting them. And then I was sending like 3 or 4 emails and probably in certain instances even getting a little to the snippy side and thinking, why is this person doing this? Especially I think at the beginning of one's career when someone just has less experience,
Right.
it's easier to have that frustration.
Yeah, you take it personally, right? And you think that you've got a great solution for someone should they only take this first meeting. And it's disheartening when they don't, but that's sales.
Yeah, on the topic of sales, obviously one of the most important traits of a successful salesperson is that resilience and how to just become okay with getting rejected 24/7, all the time. What advice do you have for people to develop that sense of resilience and really the thick skin to deal with a lot of rejection?
Know it's coming. So actually, when I was doing Shopify training way back, I was onboarding and they literally said, you're going to have a couple of quick wins. You're going to feel really hot about yourself. And then you're going to enter what's called the valley of despair. And it sounds so dramatic. You're like, oh, Shopify, it's not going to be that bad. And then you close your first couple of deals and then a month goes by and nothing. Then, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, keeps going, still nothing. You're like, okay, I'm here and it sucks, just like you told me it would. So I think the best thing someone can do when they're entering into sales is to expect it, right? Almost take it as like, okay, I've made it to that point. I'm glad that I'm progressing through this process, and it makes it a lot easier to stomach. The other thing I would mention, somewhat related, is spend your time on people who are moving. Don't try to convince somebody who's not in the market for your product or service that they, first of all, should be, that now's the right time, and that you're the right person to fill that need. It's way too much education and way too much handholding. It's not worth your time. I'm a much bigger advocate of scrape as many business accounts as you can, find the people who are moving, and then all you have to do is convince them why you. Much easier sales cycle, much faster turnarounds, and it's going to save you a lot of the frustration of trying to convince people to move that just never will.
Agreed. And I think one of the challenges in sales is a lot of the time there's maybes. There's these people who they don't want to offend you or that they don't want to make anyone unhappy, but they end up wasting way more of your time. And I remember one person once said to me is that no is always better than maybe.
It definitely is. And I think it goes back to that, like, are you barking up the wrong tree? And so what I always do, and this has been a massive help, hashtag paid's really good at this too in their sales cycle, is every step of the way, tell the person at the beginning of the meeting, hey, you at the end of this call can tell me if you're opting out. You can tell me if this isn't the right fit. You can tell me if now is not the right time or whatever it is. And then you basically say that you'll reciprocate. If you notice red flags, if you notice things that are kind of, maybe indicators of them being lukewarm, you're going to tell them that it's not the right fit, and kind of collaborating on that mutual, I don't want to say it's like a mutual plan. It really is. I hate that verbiage, but it is. And I think setting that expectation up front will save you a lot of anguish trying to chase people that just aren't ready.
An interesting anecdote relating to the hiring of employees, of which in essence companies are in essence selling to high caliber prospective employees, is I know a practice that some startups and technology companies do is that they will offer any new employee after 1 month on the job $5,000 or $10,000 to quit the job. And it's a good test to see, okay, how much does this person actually want to work here? And if they don't really like it, then take the $5,000 or $10,000 and go leave. And it saves the company probably a lot more money in the long run. But I think it's broadly analogous to some of the things you were talking about.
It completely is. And I totally see the value. I've never personally been offered that or seen a company that does it, but I totally understand. You also look at, bad fits in different teams. They end up sucking resources as opposed to contributing. So 5 to 10K is a small price to pay.
On the topic of company culture, in a relatively short time, you graduated around 5 years ago. You've worked at 3 of Canada's leading technology companies, and you worked at them before periods of substantial and during periods of substantial growth. So Shopify, Clearbank, and now hashtag paid. Can you tell us a little bit about what do you think are some of the unique learning experiences that an employee gains in working in a hyper growth environment? And then conversely, what are some of the challenges, in particular, a recent grad might face in such an environment?
It's not for the faint of heart. And I don't want to be like so cheesy about this answer, because I do think there are a lot of like very tactical pros and cons. But I think where a lot of people fall into the trap is like we like we just romanticize startup life, and it's not always, sunshine and rainbows. So for me, like I think back to those early Shopify days. Like we didn't have sales training. Like Sandler training was something I did on my nights and weekends when I was already working crazy hours, trying to just learn e-commerce as like an ecosystem, and then the technology and the platform and entrepreneurship and where these merchants were coming from. It's a lot. And again, I don't want to romanticize this, but it was 4 years of working 7 days a week. And it's like not always that easy. But I would say there's like, for all the lows, there's such a rush with it. Like you're working with such smart people, and you feel like every hour that you put in actually moves the needle in terms of the company, because they're in this hyper growth mode and everybody's working together to whatever cross that next milestone. Actually, it felt very similar to me as to when I used to play sports, right? When I'm like playing soccer and I've got other people on my team and we're working towards the same goal. And it's like, yeah, we're doing 2-a-days. Yes, we're playing tournaments where our bodies are deteriorating, but we're working towards something together. And that's just like a really great feeling, especially coming out of school, because that's kind of the world that you've lived in. And working with these startups and getting that camaraderie is almost like an extension of school, as opposed to going the corporate route where you become a number and you're in a tiny little box of responsibility and you really don't see outside that box. This is so not that same vibe. I would say a couple other like warnings of working with high growth companies is that you have to take learning and development into your own hands. Like I said, there's no one hand holding you. And so yeah, if you want to go learn how to, I'm just going to make up an example here, but how to configure Salesforce the right way or HubSpot the right way for your sales organization, that's probably not something we're going to learn through Google, right? So you have to be really resourceful, who else you speak with, what mentors you take on, and things like that to really take ownership of your own career development.
And lifelong learning is increasingly such an essential, I think, character trait or skill for all workers. And I agree. I think when a company is growing that quickly, often staff development does not become the number one focus, just because it's about hitting the financial targets or just hiring 30%, you're growing your headcount 30% in 6 months. And while there are a lot of benefits to working in that kind of high growth environment, there are a lot of challenges. It's definitely not for the faint of heart. But I definitely particularly agree with your point, though, about the bonds that people form in these companies. It's incredible. And I think that the probably greatest accelerator of human talent and the creation of new startups are successful tech companies. That the bonds people form, there's a bunch of studies that show that the most successful co-founders are not family members, they're not good friends, they're former coworkers. And I think that that's a test. And the reason why this kind of study shows is that it's because when a lot of times you might have your best friend or a really good friend, but you don't actually know what it's like to work with them. If you're actually have worked with somebody in the past and you've gotten along and you have a good relationship, there's a much higher likelihood that it's going to end up working well, and you built that kind of a trust. So to your point, I think it's working. If you want to one day become a successful founder, working in a high growth technology company is probably one of the best ways to do it.
There's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. And I have to laugh to myself as you're talking. I'm thinking back pre-COVID, there's a group of, I think 11 or 12 of us that like literally to this day, well, before COVID, traveled together. We hang out together. Like that's our new little pod of friends because of work that we did 5 years ago.
It is pretty remarkable. And I hear similar experiences with a lot of other Venture for Canada fellows. So now you're at #paid, which is one of the fastest growing technology companies in Canada, and is really a leader in the kind of influencer kind of marketing space. Can you tell us a little bit more about the company, as well as what is your current role?
Totally. So hashtag paid is a creator marketing platform. We actually started as an agency. And then if you know anything about growing agencies, as you bring on more clients, you just need more headcount. Well, it's not the most scalable way to grow a company. And so the founders were really smart and started investing in the technology to help support a lot of these enterprise clients. And it wasn't until 2 years ago we realized, oh my gosh, we can literally pivot and now sell the platform and open up the entire SMB part of this market to help them execute creator marketing campaigns. And so I think what's really powerful about what we're building is transparency, right? So if you think about influencer marketing, especially historically, it gets a pretty bad reputation for being, fluffy, hard to measure, inauthentic, all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, like I said, I was so drawn to hashtag paid because they've done such a good job combating all three of those. And so, we help brands find creators who are really an authentic fit and who are excited to work with the brand. We help them execute these campaigns. And then there's a whole paid social component to our platform where you actually start to run paid social ads through these creator accounts. And finally, light bulb moment, you have sales attribution from creators, which is really powerful for a lot of these growth stage brands.
So in your role, you get to interact and I'm sure see a lot of data on the influencer marketing sector. And I agree. I think it's evolved. A few years ago, I think that it was viewed as a kind of a much cheesier hashtag ad. Seeing stuff on Instagram and a lot of I would say low quality influencer marketing, and it's come a long way in a few years. What do you think are some of the main trends just in general in the influencer marketing category?
We're seeing a lot. I mean, like COVID was an accelerator for e-commerce in general. And I feel like creator marketing is riding the same wave. If you think about it, e-commerce has taken off, time at home to spend on social platforms has taken off. And then with a lot of people losing their job or realizing, when all they have is just their home office, that their job is not that fulfilling, we've seen a huge influx in the number of creators out there in the ecosystem. So hashtag paid is having a lot of fun the last 12 months, and we're not seeing that slow down. If we look at trends across the industry, it's really interesting. Not only are people starting to take to creators now that they've understood that there's a difference between creator and influencer, and they're starting to use them almost as like outsourced marketing, which has been really fun for me on the partnership side. And I realize I didn't answer that part of your question, Scott, but on the partnership side, we're seeing brands start to look to creators for product photography, for product descriptions, for, true ambassador programs, for messaging, for copywriting, for all of these different services beyond just creating a photo of my product and posting it on your feed. It's become really powerful where these brands are creating long-term relationships with a creator. And then over the next, 12 months, it's a long-term activation where that person really becomes an evangelist for that brand. It's really awesome to see.
What happens in the worst case, or let's say you're a brand and you partner with an influencer, and then the influencer does something despicable, or there's a massive scandal with the influencer?
So that's actually kind of an interesting point. We've always looked at it from the opposite perspective, but it's true both ways. We don't do like indefinite rights of content. So we don't like give away this creator's likeness to a brand so that should the brand ever do something that's, not to the creator's liking, they're not stuck being tied or associated to that brand. The same thing works the other way around, right? If the creator does something really, I don't know, I can't think of an example, although there was a somewhat related example of, I can't remember what company it was, but they were promoting travel through creators during COVID, which, there's a bunch of travel bans happening and they kind of got canceled for it. And so that's not great, but because there's no like physical tie to these creators, you kind of like wash your hands, you're on your way, and, no one's any the wiser.
Yeah, it's a complicated. I can imagine there are a lot of complex situations, but also on the flip side, where brands might do something that breaks the trust of the public, and then an influencer has all these paid social posts that are up. On the topic of kind of regulation for influencers, so we all see on social media where people go, hashtag ad, or they'll they have to disclose the relationships that they have with their sponsors. What are some of the main regulatory kind of aspects that influencers and brands need to be aware of. And as we look forward into the future, do you foresee that there being new kinds of regulations or oversight?
Yeah, it's kind of like the Wild West. Probably shouldn't be saying that, but that it really is, like, aside from having to disclose paid partnerships, which is enacted from Instagram itself, there really aren't too many guidelines. What we're starting to notice is a lot of exclusivity agreements or requirements coming from brands where if you're, I'm going to use an example from earlier today, if you're a vegan dog treat company, you'll require that a creator hasn't promoted other dog food brands in the past. And so if I look at, where regulation is going, I don't know if there's ever going to be like a true governing body. I think the creators unionizing might have a little bit of an impact, but I think it's more so going to be like baseline best practices, rules of engagement for using creators. And there's going to be a certain amount of transparency and control that a brand has working with a creator. But I think really it's going to be in favor of creators. So like, what content rights do the brands actually have with the content a creator is producing? What's the extent of that relationship, timeline, duration, commitment, things like that, but nothing regulatory in terms of, legal or anything like that.
What advice do you have for both creators and then also for brands on how to make sure that there's a good fit between the two?
Stop looking just at follower count. I have that conversation all the time. A brand comes in, they've got, a super, super niche product, right? I'm going to use one recently, a menopause product that reduces the symptoms of menopause. And they want to go work with any creator that has millions of followers. And that's not the best indicator of who's actually going to convert well. So if I were this menopause brand, I would be looking, okay, total follower count is good, but that's certainly not the only metric I'm looking at. I need to know their engagement rate, who's commenting on these photos, what portion of their audience is male, female, and then within that, what portion of that female audience is within different age brackets. And so I think the biggest faux pas a brand can make is picking people based on the wrong metrics. And that's something that our platform helps highlight, right? So how do we go beyond the surface level to actually find people who are not only a great fit demographic wise, but who are passionate about your product and are actually going to invest in the story or the message behind what they're sharing? So I would say that's it on the brand side. On the creator side, I feel like the biggest mistake that a creator can make is accepting too much creative direction from the brands that they're working with. So I can't believe this happens, but it does. A brand will actually produce their own content in a studio. For example, they'll pay for a creator, could be $500, could be $1,000. Like, it gets pretty pricey. And then they'll say, hey, you should just share the content that I've already produced. And it seems like obviously that's a bad fit, but it happens all the time. And this is something our platform is actively trying to combat. You're contracting a creator, yes, because they have a big following, but also because they know how to build that following. They know what resonates. They know what kinds of content is going to generate engagements. They know what time to post. Like, I think the worst thing a creator can do is just to relinquish a lot of that creative control.
I agree. It's interesting on Instagram, like when you're following different creators, and you can tell the people who are more strategic that do it for a living because they produce their own content. And then you'll see some who, in particular, I find sometimes more celebrities who maybe aren't like full-time, like this isn't their full-time job, and they'll just share really cheesy things from the, like, it's completely off the aesthetic of their brand. That yeah.
And like, that's a really tough thing because that brand paid a ton of money to get that product into the creator's hands. I even think of like a Kylie Jenner, for example, who makes $1 million per Instagram post, which is insane. And then it's so inauthentic. Like, is that actually generating as many sales as if you were to use smaller creators and more of them? You actually might get a better return. But for some reason, a lot of brands just can't get the celebrity thing out of their head.
Out of interest for smaller kind of, let's say somebody has 10,000 Instagram followers and they do a paid post, how much will they pull in terms of like, and obviously there's probably a range and different things.
Yeah, it's a good question though. And it's, one that comes up every single day. So if you look at average creator rates, we break it down by asset type. So are you getting a story video? Are you getting just an image? Are you getting a carousel? Are you getting a real video? So on and so forth. For a post, You can expect around $500 for someone with 10,000 followers. However, we have some people that just think a lot of themselves and they have, 1,000 followers and they'll charge crazy amounts. But I would say $500 a post would be a good average.
I can imagine in the creator influencer marketing kind of space that there'd be some interesting characters and probably some people who may have probably unrealistic fee levels. So let's say, changing it up, if somebody has 1 million Instagram followers, what and they were posting a post, what would be a kind of range that one would expect to charge?
Yeah. So it'll again really depend on like their interest category, their vertical, and then what the nature of the post is. Could be anything from, $2,000 to upwards of $30,000 per post.
Wow, that is so influencers and creators, if they've built that kind of platform for themselves, they can do quite well for themselves, I can
It's
imagine.
incredibly lucrative. Yeah. And if I had a stronger Instagram game, that I would be dabbling, but sometimes you have to pick your battles.
What do you think? Everyone has access to social media, and there's definitely a lot of people who probably want to be influencers and to develop. What do you think? Kind of moving beyond just like the ability to kind of monetize it, but what do you think are the attributes that really make somebody stand out as a content creator or influencer in terms of to build that following?
It's a really good question. And we're getting asked that all the time. In fact, we're actually bringing someone on to create a creator academy through #paid, where aspiring creators can come in and learn the ropes, build their following, and then get matched with some of these brands on a gifting level campaign, as opposed to being paid for content right off the bat to kind of, get their feet wet as they move into that profession. But I would say the more niche, the better, right? If you can come in because you've got a hyper specific, okay, I'll give it an example. I follow this woman, she's out of the UK, and she does cleaning videos of her house. And you're like, there's no way she would have a lot of followers. So she's got almost 1 million followers, and all she does is clean her house and record it. So I think number one is like find something that you're so passionate about that it doesn't even feel like you're working, and then watch all these other people start to get on board and kind of watch your journey with you. The other thing is there, again, kind of like sales, it's not just art. This is actually a science. There are specific numbers of posts, reels, stories that you should be promoting every single week to help bolster your visibility and your discoverability on the platform. So giveaways are amazing, amazing tactics for growing followers. Even things like reposting other people's stories, commenting, being active in your community, all of those things to get your name out there a little bit more, and then you'll see your follower count start to increase.
I imagine this depends on the creator, but there's a proliferation of different platforms. So obviously TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, list goes on. And sometimes I think about these influencers is that and creators, it must just be exhausting, particularly if they have, it's like managing like 10 different accounts. So I kind of have a few related questions. The first is, to what extent do creators focus on just one or two of these platforms and say this is really kind of a focus? And then second is, in general, what platforms tend to deliver the most value from an advertising perspective, or does it just depend on the influencer?
Yeah, good question. Your first question, which was how often do people just pick a couple of platforms and stick to those? Almost always. It's actually really funny. You think of, like you just mentioned, that's a huge list. But in order to do it right, it's a lot of work to produce content just for Instagram. And then if you're doing YouTube videos on top, that's a whole other job. And so I would say the people who have the largest following and who really understand their place in the market are usually only on 1 to 2 platforms. And so for us, we see Instagram as the kind of obvious first choice for a lot of these creators. And then now we're seeing almost a division. And I don't want to overgeneralize here, but a lot of the younger creators are leaning on TikTok, which is probably not a surprise. And then a lot of the less or the more niche, I should say, the less broad categories are living on YouTube. So if you think anything auto, they're probably not on TikTok, they're probably on YouTube. But if it's, a young beauty influencer or creator, she's probably living on TikTok just as much as she is Instagram.
That makes a ton of sense, and I couldn't imagine if somebody, especially if they're just doing it just themselves, to manage 10 different social media accounts would probably just lead somebody to insanity. So it's
Yeah, 100%. I even think I watched some YouTubers, and their entire day is editing video. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever done it. It is a super labor intensive process, and you just feel like it's kind of mind numbing. I couldn't imagine doing it day in and day out. So kudos to them.
I feel like a lot of these creators, they make, if they're build up a big following, they make they're rewarded for it. But it's definitely not a job for the faint of heart. It would be, and it's a job I feel like you have to be like 24/7. Like, you can't really take vacation.
Oh my gosh, timing is everything. Yeah. And if you have like a funny joke that's relevant, that needs to be published now. It can't even wait until tomorrow. So yeah, it's a different level of hustle.
Do you find have very many of the creators that you've worked with or experienced burnout, or just kind of said, I need to take a pause, this is too much?
Yeah, I don't even know specifically through hashtag Paids Network, but I even know the creators that I follow just personally. They'll go on hiatuses all the time, right? So they have a baby, or life just gets too much, or they're in a dark place mentally, and then they just completely go dark. And I feel like that's true of most jobs. If you're overworking yourself, at some point you need to scale back. But I think especially with creators, because they're so public and every single thing they do is subject to, you know, dozens and dozens or even hundreds of thousands of opinions. It's a lot.
Yeah, and I can imagine when you have that kind of following, and you're, these creators will respond to comments, and part of the job is to engage with their fans. If you have 1 million Instagram followers, there's going to be trolls who attack you, and it must just be, you have to develop a really thick skin to read through probably that.
Yeah, well, and I even have an example. We were going to have a brand on our podcast, and they opened up a pop-up shop right across from a Vietnamese restaurant, and they were a bone broth company, and everyone canceled them because they were like taking over this, this street corner, and they were going to put this Vietnamese restaurant out of business. And she had to like go offline, had to gather her thoughts, work with the PR team, and then come back and formally apologize. Like, I can only imagine how draining that is mentally and emotionally.
Oh yeah, it would be brutal, and I think especially with the rise of social media as critics, it can be particularly challenging. And also, it's super sensitive for a lot of these brands. Like, all it takes sometimes is one really bad social post, and things can just blow up.
Oh, cancel culture is real. It is real. I think it's like, there's a silver lining in that it's helping people be more mindful, but I also think it's every creator's biggest fear.
I can imagine it's probably something to some extent that these people with huge platforms are fearing like 24/7.
Totally. And some are using it, right? Some are using this platform that they've built to really affect change and to help change people's minds, and they're doing great work with it. I would guess that the large majority are feeling at least some sense of fear, hesitation before they post things, getting other people to double check it and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can imagine if somebody has 5 million Instagram followers, having like a list of, there are 7 people who vet every post to make sure it's okay.
Totally. Totally. And then back to your other question, Scott, about advertising, which platforms tend to perform the best. There actually isn't one silver bullet, which, is not the best answer to give. But if you look at the actual product category and the target market, it's completely nuanced platform to platform. So I would say, just because the default platform for creators seems to be Instagram ads are performing really well on aggregate relative to other platforms. But like I said, if you're an auto company, I would funnel all of my money into YouTube ads, and same with TikTok. If I have a much younger demographic, I would spend my money there. So yeah, no clear winner, but you can usually tell just by the product category.
Yeah, go where your audience is and where they're watching content. And I think it seems like it's the ultimate message. So you mentioned you have your own podcast, which is called They Get It. What is one episode that you recommend our listeners check out on your podcast, and why do you recommend it?
I love that question. I would go listen to Nick's episode from Midday Squares. The audio was terrible because I literally had the wrong mic hooked up, so excuse the terrible sound quality. But in terms of content, he was killer. He was so vulnerable. He shared, some of the trials and tribulations in building Midday Squares, and then he also went into his own mental health journey. And I just think for all of these entrepreneurs that are trying to be so polished and perfect and, look a certain way, he was just the complete opposite of that, and it was a breath of fresh air.
I agree. I think that some of the best interviews are the ones where people just open up and they're incredibly vulnerable in talking about the challenges. And one of the challenges I think in in the entrepreneurship space is there's kind of like the Gary Vaynerchuk the hustle culture, and it just creates these unrealistic expectations that these entrepreneurs are perfect, or that they just hustle 24/7 and are constantly like growing their businesses. And the reality is that a lot of entrepreneurs face mental health related challenges. And I would say even myself during this pandemic, speaking like personally, I've had huge challenges at different points, and I think it's important, in particular in the entrepreneurship space, where I think we lionize people, and often the full picture isn't often painted. That there are these more candid kind of conversations, and also from a content perspective, it's what people actually connect with, because there's that vulnerability.
Totally. If you look at the episodes we've done that perform the best, it's not the, wow, you're so amazing, tell us all the great things that happened. Like there's almost a level of like relatability that happens with that vulnerability. And if you look at the DMs we get for suggested content, it's always, you guys talk about being bootstrapped and all these companies doing it, but like, I can't feed myself as an entrepreneur. What do I do? Or how do these other people feel? And it's like, there's a whole layer that's not sexy and romantic about entrepreneurship. And I think the more honest people can be about that, the rest of the community will feel so supported.
I completely agree, and I think it's something that it's so important in conversations around entrepreneurship in Canada and around the world. On the topic of kind of closing the conversation and thinking around kind of career advice, is in 5 years you've done a lot of different things, and you've worked in a lot of different kind of roles. If you could go back in time and give advice to your 22-year-old self just graduating from Carleton, what advice would you give, and why?
I think about this a lot. So I love the fact that you're asking. I think the number one thing, and there are many, but I think the number one is that you can be in a room full of people, and I can guarantee that there's someone who's more educated, who has more experience, who's better connected, insert XYZ, anything that you're insecure about, there's going to be someone that's better at that than you, but it doesn't make them any better equipped to go do the thing that you want to do, right? It's not a zero-sum game. If you're excited about a business idea, just because someone else could do it doesn't prevent you from doing it. And I think that was something I struggled with a little bit getting into tech. All these engineers and people who had studied this in school, and I was a sports reporter, didn't even know what an API was, and I sit in these chairs trying to do the same work, and I just felt so out of my depth. And then you realize, like, if you truly have a growth mindset and you put that into practice, you can go do it. Just because they may be, predisposed doesn't mean it's off the table for you.
A huge challenge that young people face is in essence what you're talking about, which is this imposter syndrome. It's a sense that they're frauds, or that they can't they don't have the capabilities to achieve. And I think it's something that is so challenging and so pervasive, and something I've dealt with at different points. And I agree. I think it's it's interesting. I think on one of the things I've been reflecting on is why has imposter syndrome become so prevalent? And I think my hypothesis potentially is that a lot of it is actually linked with the rise of perfectionism as well. And this sense that recently I've kind of been reflecting on my own self and thinking, oh, I always thought perfectionism was good in some way. I thought, oh, that means I'm a high achiever, that I'm ambitious. And I've recently come to this point of thinking, hey, perfectionism is actually really bad. It creates all these mental health challenges. It creates unrealistic expectations. If happiness equals reality minus expectations, if you're a perfectionist, you're literally never happy, and literally never happy. And it's interesting because I think that when someone's perfectionist, then they also feel like they're constantly an imposter because their expectations are so high that they never achieve them. The final note just to say is it's interesting. Studies have shown that of surveys of young people from like the 80s till compared to I think it's 2016, that the percentage of young people who are identified based or are assessed as being perfectionists based on the kind of peer-reviewed kind of surveys has increased from like roughly 10% to around 25%. And it's a huge, I think, pervasive, and it also relates to this entrepreneurship conversation, which is that I think sometimes we set this bar that people have to be perfect all the time. And then creates a lot of these issues, including imposter syndrome.
Totally, totally. And if I can just share one anecdote, I know we're trying to wrap, but if I look at the brands that I've had on my own podcast, not a single one is still selling the product that they initially sold when they started. So if you look at the actual trajectory of what entrepreneurship looks like, it's a constant evolution of product, brand, messaging, company in general, headcount, you name it. And it's so funny to me that this idea of launching with something perfect holds so many of us back, when in reality, nobody launches with a perfect product. Even that comparison, like you're comparing yourself against a moving target, it's just not realistic.
And life is always about doing experiments, and it's about failing, and it's about making mistakes. And I agree. There's Venture for Canada fellowship program, which you participated in, is still a huge component of what VFC does. But over the last 7 years, we have evolved substantially, and now do all these new programs that I wouldn't have even thought of 7 years ago. So I definitely relate to I'm doing someone's interviewing me tomorrow, and they asked me a question about Venture for Canada's original business plan, and it was funny. I was looking it up this morning in my email from 7 years ago, and one of the things I thought that was hilarious is reading through the business plan, and all the way it's very topical given the conversation right now, just the extent to which it's way different than what I thought 7 years ago. So as was it Voltaire once wrote that don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think it's something so important in both entrepreneurship and life. Like sometimes let things go, and no one's perfect, and that's okay. Kelsey, this has been a wonderful conversation. We have covered a ton of different topics, including your experience as a campus reporter and how that influenced your entrepreneurial journey, the benefits of working in sales, the pros and cons of working in high growth technology companies, the rise of influencer marketing, how to be a really successful creator, a ton of different topics. I think your career has been fascinating to date, and you have a lot of really interesting experience across all of these different companies. Definitely recommend our listeners check out her podcast. They get it. It's definitely a great podcast to listen to. Kelsey, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Scott. So much fun.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.